But I think that white supremacy is real. It has obviously done a number on, members of the African diaspora around the world, right? Um, and in terms of African Americans, because of the history of enslavement, Jim Crow, right? And the way in which kind of, capitalism and neoliberalism still seeks to weaponize whiteness, right, and to disenfranchise blackness. My argument is that for many African Americans, that what the history of Black American engagements with Sudan shows is that white supremacy and a Black population's experience with white supremacy is the most important factor for determining solidarity.
Genocide is a new word combining the Greek word genos meaning race or group, with the root of the Latin sidere meaning to kill.
Became interested in genocide because it happened so many times.
Power is all against one. Violence is the opposite. The extreme is one against all.
This is Not to Forgive, but to Understand, a podcast series discussing genocide studies with experts and those connected to its critical questions. I am Luis Gonzalez Aponte, co-host with Saba Karim.
And what we're about is really to try to understand why evil happens, why there are perpetrations in genocidal scenarios and scenarios of mass atrocity. Not to forgive, but to understand.
Forgive, but to understand.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
In this episode, we speak with Christopher Tounsel, a historian of modern Sudan and an associate professor at the University of Washington, whose work examines race, religion, and the politics of solidarity. Drawing on his book, Bounds of Blackness, our conversation explores how African Americans have engaged with Sudan from Cold War diplomacy to contemporary conflict, and how identity, media, and global politics shape who is seen, ignored, or mobilized in moments of mass violence. In 2006, then-Senator Barack Obama, speaking at a rally for Darfur, said, "Today we know what is right and what is wrong. The slaughter of innocents is wrong. 2 million people driven from their homes is wrong. Women gang raped while gathering firewood is wrong. Silence, acquiescence, paralysis in the face of genocide is wrong. If we care, the world will care. If we act, then the world will follow." How did Obama's presidency change the solidarity between people across the United States, Sudan, and South Sudan?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. Yes, I think that starting with Barack Obama in 2006 is such a great starting point because, of course, as a native Chicagoan, right, the kind of Barack Obama rise from senator of Illinois to the presidency was such a galvanizing social moment, right? And I think that a part of the excitement that he generated, right, was in creating or encouraging these types of solidarities, right? So when Barack Obama is still a U.S. senator, right, he travels to Chad where he meets with Sudanese refugees. And so throughout his first presidential campaign, he is trying to raise Sudan as this example of kind of the U.S. being responsible, not for the genocide, but in trying to run as the leader of the free world, saying, look, when atrocities are going on in Sudan, it's our responsibility to help, right? And throughout his presidency, he continues to kind of keep Sudan as a primary point of his foreign policy. He mentioned Sudan in his first State of the Union address. He also mentioned Sudan when he famously marches across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to commemorate the 1965 March on Selma. And in that particular speech, he directly tries to encourage this type of solidarity between the freedom struggle in Sudan with the civil rights movement in the US by saying that, in essence, the move for civil rights in this country, as typified by moments like the Edmund Pettus Bridge, March on Selma, was kith and kin, if you will, with the fight of Sudanese people for self-determination. So yeah, so Sudan really kind of figured prominently in his foreign policy, not from a kind of state security aspect, but from a sense of U.S. soft power.
And building on that, if, as you write, quote, foreign policy conducted by Black people did not by default mean a Black foreign policy, close quote, what would a genuinely Black foreign policy look like in a case like Sudan if that concept is coherent here?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think that, what a Black foreign policy would look like would be a lot of what we saw in terms of the kind of global anti-apartheid movement, right? But also even going further to the roots of African decolonization, right? Where you had figures like Dr. King going to Ghana to celebrate the first independence of that country, right? So there's a way in which I think a Black foreign policy would look like really centering the oppression of Black peoples on account of race, right? South Africa, obviously, for decades represented this very clear example, right, of a white minority government disenfranchising, Black peoples in its own country, right? Sudan was a bit more complicated, right? Because you've got a government in Omar al-Bashir that was really trying to encourage kind of an Arabization project, right? And it was this project that caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, not just to the west in Darfur, but also south in southern Sudan as well. And so, in my opinion, what a kind of Black foreign policy would have looked like would be to really kind of magnify the fact that people are suffering in Sudan and that this is a part of the same genealogy of kind of 20th and 21st century anti-Blackness, right? But of course, politicians have to navigate a minefield, right, of not trying to offend all parties, right? And Barack Obama being the first African American president, he particularly had to tread quite lightly because, while his Blackness is undeniable, right? He couldn't appear to all of his constituents, Black or non-Black, as having a, hyper focus on Blackness, right? And so in being the president of all races and peoples in this country, he had to tread very lightly. So I think that there's a difference, right? And I talk about this in the book between having Black people in very powerful, influential foreign policy positions, but then kind of operating with an explicitly kind of ethos of Black solidarity in those positions.
Right. And can you speak about the South Sudan as a case example here? Because I believe in your book you referenced Barack Obama invoking Martin Luther King Jr., speaking about Ghanaian independence. Can you speak about what South Sudan represented in this case?
Absolutely. So South Sudan really represented what I argue is a sense of Black emancipation, Black liberation, but a Black liberation that was different from other types of African liberation that are much more well known, right? I mentioned South Africa, you mentioned Ghana, right? Because of the history of African colonialism, for centuries, the quote unquote oppressors, right, have been Europeans, right? The Portuguese, English, French, Belgians, right? South Sudan, in some ways, represented the final example of Black liberation against a racial other, right? But the racial other in this case represented, for many, Northern Sudanese Arabs. And so you've got this kind of complicated dynamic, right, where the people who are kind of recognized as the quote unquote bad guys, right, are not white and they're not European, well, how do people kind of understand that? Well, a lot of African Americans in this country, going back to the 1960s, right, recognized that South Sudan was participating in a type of global Black freedom struggle. And so you had Black folks like, Whitney Young, for example, Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, right? TD Jakes, big pastor out of Texas, really trying to draw attention to the plight and the suffering of Black South Sudanese. And so by the time July 2011 comes around and South Sudan becomes independent, I think that Barack Obama was pretty tactile, right? And on one hand, invoking Dr. King, who is obviously connected with kind of Black freedom more than most other figures in history, but also, right, even in invoking Dr. King, Dr. King in some ways in his afterlife has become such a kind of global, worldwide symbol that for some, a reference like that could seem a bit hollow, could seem a bit safe, right? It's different if someone is referencing, Malcolm X, Eldridge Cleaver, Patrice Lumumba, right? Dr. King is like, at this point, he's reached like Gandhi level, right? Where, to reference him is not very controversial or provocative, but it can still be too.
I sense that there is, and even as an African myself, I sense this frustration. And I wonder whether you encountered it as an academic researching these other African matters, including obviously your research on South Sudan. What is inherently, if at all, frustrating about the perception of the politics in that region from people over here? And of course, this is a very open-ended question. And obviously, when we speak about people over here, there are different levels of society, people who are academics, who are non-academics, people who know about Sudan, who actually know where it is, etc. So tell us more about this more practical hands-on experience you've had when dealing with this subject.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, so I love it because there's so many directions where I can take that question. And so I'll kind of isolate two. One is the fact that unfortunately, I think that within this country and in lots of Western contexts, Sudan really represents all of the most pejorative stereotypes of the African continent, right? This place of endless chaos, warlords, poverty, corruption, um, and just really intractable, right? A place that for most Westerners is very hard to understand, right? A very kind of unnuanced place of trauma, right? And so, as someone examining Sudan and having traveled to South Sudan, I think in some ways, and I'm going to kind of tread lightly here, but even among academics, I think that one is more likely to find professors, researchers, and scholars of, just for lack of a better word, safer countries or countries that are perceived to be safer and less complicated. Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, Tanzania, right? All countries, African or non-African, have problems, issues, traumas, right? But in some sense, I have found that within African studies as a discipline, Sudan and South Sudan have been marginalized, right? And that there are other countries that seem to get the proverbial lion's share of attention. And that if and when Sudan or South Sudan become relevant, it's for really bad reasons, like what's been going on since April 2023. So that's what I would say about that, right? That there's, on one hand, this sense that Sudan is this easy stand-in for lots of people of all of the problems facing post-colonial Africa. But on the other hand, even within African studies, I think that Sudan and South Sudan are very much at the margins. And so part of, the reason why I do my work is to, not say that Sudan or South Sudan is more important than any of, the other 52 countries in Africa, but to really bring Sudan more towards the kind of center, right? And to make sure that, if we are to believe in kind of Pan-Africanism, not just as a symbolic kind of romantic emotional idea, but as something like real and genuine, like a real ideal that should be pursued. No country on the continent should be on the margins, and that includes the island countries as well, right? That, Mauritius being an African country, right? And considering it just as African as the Central African Republic, right? That takes a lot of work, work that should not have to be done, but practically speaking, work that does need to be done.
I want to zoom into a small case that I think stands out within your book, and that is what is the history between Black solidarity and Zionism and the state of Israel? And how does that background help us or help explain why, as you note, African American support for Arabs or Israel has never been unified? It's not a monolith, especially in the case of Sudan.
Yeah. So this is kind of, I think, one of the most compelling parts of the book that I was not expecting to emerge when I embarked on the project. But yeah, so um, it really goes all the way back to the 1960s, right? Obviously, the state of Israel becomes independent in 1948. The Arab League famously, declares no recognition of Israel, no peace with Israel, right? No negotiation. And the Arab League actually makes this proclamation at the 1967 Arab League conference in Khartoum, which Khartoum was desperate to host in order to show the Arab League members, hey, we are a truly, you know, Arab country, right? Um, and so how this kind of translates into African American views of Sudan becomes really tricky because on one hand, you had some African Americans who identified the state of Israel as a, white minority government, basically participating in apartheid-like, genocidal behaviors, right? And so some African Americans basically side with the Sudanese government in its opposition to Israel because they see Sudan's opposition to Israel as a kind of anti-colonial move, right? However, right, Sudan in the 1960s was in its own state of civil war against South Sudanese rebels who identified as Black, right? And so it gets really tricky because African Americans, some are supporting an Arab-led Sudanese government in its fight against Israel. But what do we do about the Sudanese government's fight against Black South Sudanese, right? And so you've got other African Americans in very, prominent Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender arguing for support for South Sudan, right? It gets even thornier because the South Sudanese rebels were fighting against the Sudanese government, you had Israeli spies and Israeli proxies in East Africa supporting these Black South Sudanese, right? Because from the Israeli standpoint, they wanted to destabilize the Sudan because Sudan was obviously, supporting countries like Egypt against Israel. So you have these kind of competing solidarities, right? You've got some African Americans supporting Black South Sudanese against the Arab Sudanese government, but then you've got other African Americans supporting Sudan out of a kind of anti-Israeli anti-colonial approach. And so that division is really prominent in the 1960s. It does kind of taper off once we get to kind of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. But that's just to say that once South Sudan becomes independent, and I talk about that in my first book, um, South Sudanese start to kind of read these Old Testament scriptures, which were essentially Jewish prophecies about this ancient African kingdom of Cush. Well, some South Sudanese begin to read these Jewish scriptures as prophesying South Sudanese independence. And so you've got this kind of South Sudanese affinity, if you will, with the modern state of Israel. Riek Machar, who is the vice president of South Sudan, famously travels to Jerusalem. South Sudan decides to open up its national embassy in Israel in Jerusalem rather than in the capital of Tel Aviv, right? So again, these kind of, symbolic you know, um, moves to identify with kind of the ancient Jewish past, right? Um, so yeah, so it's very asymmetrical, at times very kind of counterintuitive, but very real all at the same time.
And that brings me to a theme that has come across in several of our other interviews on this channel, where we speak about how populations in the United States, in European countries too, experience and interact with a genocide or a conflict from afar. And I felt in your book, much of the analysis focuses on how others determine who is or is not included within a particular racial or social category worthy of protection and solidarity with. I'm interested in the inverse here, however. Under what conditions do individuals themselves foreground one identity over another? And what does that shift mean for the formation of or limits of solidarity? And as a smaller, aside,
Mhm.
you have people go ahead and sometimes suppress a national identity and foreground a racial identity, or in reverse. And these things are a reflective interplay between what's going on in the environment around them, sometimes driven by conflict or politics. But again, going back to the question here, what does that shift mean for the formation of solidarity?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that towards the tail end of my book, what becomes very apparent, particularly when I began talking about the Nation of Islam and its approach to the Sudanese government, there's a way in which, those who are kind of following events from afar tend to, as you've just said, really begin to create solidarities based off of what we might call abstract identities, right? So if you're a member of the Nation of Islam in the mid 1990s and you've never been to Sudan, you don't know Sudanese Arabic, perhaps you've never even been to the continent. Maybe you've never spoken to a Sudanese person who can provide a firsthand testimony of, having to leave their home because the Janjaweed came through and, burned the whole town to the ground, right? Um, there's a way in which one might say, well, I'm not Sudanese, I'm not African, but I am Muslim. And by virtue of the fact that this non-white Muslim country is being raked through the coals in the Boston Globe, the New York Times, CNN, the State Department is saying they're a state sponsor of terror. Um, I'm actually going to stand by Sudan. They are a world pariah, but I'm with them. If no one else is going to stand with them, I will, right? These are the kinds of things that we begin to see in the 1990s, right? Where for a person like a Minister Louis Farrakhan in the Nation of Islam, he decides to kind of go against the grain by saying this is a Muslim country and Islamophobia is real, right? Well, what does it mean then for a black Muslim like Louis Farrakhan to, in essence, decide to really play up the religious solidarity, but to downplay the racial solidarity, right, of Black South Sudanese who are being oppressed, right? And so this is really where I think the politics of solidarity come into play, right? And by politics, I mean at the micro scale, how do we as not just, citizens and nations, but how do we on a very granular individual level decide what matters more, right? What kind of defining driving factors do we use when we do decide to maybe read a newspaper piece about, something?
I would like to go ahead and pose that question to you from how you presented in the book, where you say, when African Americans proclaim Black Lives Matter, which lives are we invoking? And connected to that, what are the consequences of a form of racial solidarity that allows one to be a racial kin in one moment and then an antagonist in another?
Yeah. So this is my one of my main conclusions. And, I'm going to say it with my chest because I feel strongly about this, even though I feel uncomfortable because I know how some people might interpret it, right? But I think that, you know, white supremacy is real. It has obviously done a number on, members of the African diaspora around the world, right? Um, and in terms of African Americans, because of the history of enslavement, Jim Crow, right? And the way in which kind of, capitalism and neoliberalism still, still seeks to weaponize whiteness, right, and to disenfranchise blackness. My argument is that for many African Americans, that what the history of Black American engagements with Sudan shows is that white supremacy and a Black population's experience with white supremacy is the most important factor for determining solidarity, right? It was easier for a lot of African Americans to identify with Black South Africans because the apartheid government was a white European state, right? It was easy for African Americans to really rally behind Ghana in 1957 because Ghana, right, being a West African country, was one of the countries that millions of Black Africans were taken from and um, shipped across the Atlantic, right? But with Sudan, right, there's this kind of like, well, we know that they're Black because they're an African, but they're not Black like us, right? They don't share the same history of plantation enslavement, right? Um, they don't share the same history of apartheid slash Jim Crow in the way that, folks in South Africa and the Rhodesias did, right? And so I think that in 2026, right, it is more difficult for African Americans to build a sense of racial solidarity with other members of the African diaspora if there is not that very um, kind of accessible comparative framework of similar experiences under white supremacy. And so that's why, to me, I think that places like Sudan and the Horn of Africa, and I would even say the whole of North Africa. So, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Egypt. I think that in the African American purview, those countries and regions do not receive the same type of attention in the Black press, Black media, right? Uh, church spaces, Black politics, the Congressional Black Caucus, the NAACP. issues in those countries don't get the same attention as they do in places like Congo, the home of Patrice Lumumba, right? Um, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, right? Because it's more easy to say, oh yeah, Congo, that was the country of Patrice Lumumba, the Belgian Congo, Leopold, right? Nigeria, this place of, this was a white British colony, a lot of slaves taken from there. Ghana, same thing, South Africa. But Sudan, Tunisia, are those really black? Yes, they're African, but like how African are they, quote unquote, really, right? So that's my argument.
When you're saying this, I'm thinking of Gayatri Spivak's essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? That
Okay.
essay, she speaks about, and she raises this point, which I think all of us who are involved in the humanities should be aware of. She speaks about those forces that are the forces that are in power, that are in control of the master narrative, ultimately govern whether the subaltern gets to speak. And very often she says that these powerful forces speak on behalf of the others, of the marginalized, which of course doesn't help the marginalized at all, because those in power don't really understand what's going on with the others. So right now, what I see in what you're saying is, while the African Americans, say in America, feel that they are the other, compared to the white population here,
Hmm.
they also at another level define, another level of alterity that is going on. So we're not speaking about a binary form of alterity between those in power and those who are marginalized, but those who are marginalized, when their voices are heard as well, they are also involved in the process of othering other nations.
Exactly. I think that that's exactly it, right? There's a scholar, Eve Trout Powell, who is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and she referenced kind of early 20th century Egypt as, quote, the colonized colonizer, right? This idea that Egypt, on one hand, was subjected under the Union Jack, right? But at the same time, Egypt has a predatory relationship with Sudan, right? So on one hand, they're colonized, but on the other hand, they have not historically treated Sudan as an equal, right? I think that there's a similar dynamic, right? While I wouldn't call African, well, you know what? Some actually have argued that when it comes to global blackness, right, that African Americans have had an outsized hegemonic influence, right? The first five Pan-African conferences in the 20th century were all in the West, right? But it's not until, the 1945 Manchester Conference that there were more Africans from the continent at the conference than those from the African diaspora, right? So I absolutely do think that you are right in that on one hand, African Americans can claim the historical experience of being othered within the context of, kind of white power structures in this country. But when kind of speaking across the globe, right, um, African Americans have an outsized influence on basically telling members of the diaspora, well, what causes should we be all paying attention to, right? Um, and so that can be really problematic, right? Because yes, when the, kind of clarion calls of Black Lives Matter or, global Black solidarities comes out, um, oftentimes those that are kind of those um those peoples, those countries, those issues that are, most quickly kind of brought up and most quickly broadcast are those that African Americans are identifying, right? Um, as an African American, right, I see the tension there, right? Because on one hand, I'm all for, this idea of global blackness and, not allowing kind of Western boundaries, right, to, keep to different groups of the African diaspora separate, distinct, right? But at the same time, it kind of perpetuates the marginalization of certain African countries, right, from others. And I think, and I'm also, gonna say this out loud, but I think that's what makes, I think, African American engagement with Gaza very compelling when compared to places like Sudan.
Yeah.
Because again, I think Gaza represents for many African Americans the type of kind of historic white colonial white supremacist oppression of non-white peoples. And
Yeah.
so a lot of African Americans kind of engage Gaza through that lens, right? But what happens when, Rwanda in 1994 takes place, right? Where the people perpetuating that genocide are themselves Black, right? What happens in Nigeria during the Biafran War, right? When you've got Nigerians slaughtering other Nigerians, right? What happens in Sudan when you've got, you know, Black slash Arab people killing each other, right? So, all very kind of big questions, but they all go back to this kind of politics of solidarity, right? So yeah.
I think that we can't go without saying on this note, especially within the context of African American communication with the globe, about Black media. You speak a lot about Black media in your book, and initially, I would want to ask, what role did Black media play in mobilizing and organizing and legitimizing indignation around the crisis in Sudan, and what does it look like today, in your view?
Sure. I say this proudly because my wife is a communications prof, and she's known about the power of the Black press, far longer than I have. But it was really in, crafting this book that I saw how powerful and how influential Black newspapers, right, for much of basically the first 6 decades of the 20th century were in terms of really introducing African Americans to Sudan, right? Black newspapers played a huge role. I mean, you had, Black newspaper correspondents in Sudan and Ethiopia in the 1930s, right? When the Italians invade Ethiopia, right? And so there's a way in which Black newspapers were so ubiquitous, right? That I think that the average stat is, or sorry, the stat is that, one edition of a Black newspaper would have been seen by 8 different sets of eyeballs, right? And so there's a way in which, in the kind of pre-TV age, the Black newspaper was really a pedagogical tool for millions of African Americans, not only about what was going on in Sudan, but what was going on in, Ghana, South Africa, Cuba, the UK, right? So Black newspapers play a huge role. But also Black magazines, Jet Magazine, Ebony Magazine. Um, I would say in addition to the Black press, right? HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, right? Today, Northwestern University is known as kind of, you know, a school with a particularly long engagement with African studies, but it was in fact Howard University, right, in Washington, D.C., that had the first department of African studies. And that was really created by this professor, William Leo Hansberry, who was an enthusiast of ancient Sudanese history. And so if you were at Howard University as early as the 1920s, you could take college courses on ancient Egypt and ancient Sudan. All this going on within a broader context of people in Jim Crow, not being able to, share restaurants and being lynched, right? So there's this way in which both the Black press, but also HBCUs have had a really huge impact. In more recent history, this has continued. So at a school like Howard, Howard in the 1990s and 2000s, when the Second Sudanese Civil War was going on, and once the Darfur genocide, really launches in 2003, Howard hosts symposiums, right, on what's going on. Their school newspaper, The Hilltop, publishes editorials about what's going on in Sudan. And in 2005, Howard University becomes the first HBCU to divest from Sudan, right? And so there's this way in which kind of institutions of higher learning that are, created by and for African Americans start to kind of marshal their institutional might for very political and humanitarian purposes. But kind of in fast forwarding to the present day, we know that Black media has continued to direct attention to the Sudan, particularly since April of 2023. BET.com, Blavity, Black Twitter, all of these spaces have, shined a light in terms of what is going on in the Sudan. You've also had, conferences at, several institutions, but, the University of Michigan and Stanford and, Duke. It's become a moment in kind of US higher ed in terms of kind of events that are geared towards the Sudan.
How do you see the current landscape of media given this, ranging from movements like BLM
Mm-hmm.
to reactionary figures such as Candace Owens, who are reaching
Yes.
large audiences with anti Zionist perspectives, shaping responses to the ongoing conflict?
So I'll be completely real with you, right? I think while you have had Black media attention on Sudan, I think that, and I'm positive that, the kind of objective metrics will also bear this out. I think that African Americans are engaging more with what's going on in Palestine than what's going on in Sudan. And I think that's just an objective reality, right? Um, the I think the noble, um, reality is that African Americans continue to engage with the suffering of, Black and brown people, right, around the world, right? But this goes back to, my kind of larger point about the politics of solidarity and how that bears out in terms of engagement. And I think that today, if you kind of look on, the most popular accounts on Black Twitter and Instagram, if you go to kind of, Black news sites like theroot.com, you'll see attention, right, and a lot of pieces on Gaza, right? That's important. That's huge. Like, I applaud that, right? But Sudan really is like on the literal back burner, right? And so, as an African American who would like to believe in, the equality of Black suffering everywhere, right? That no, population's pain is worth more than another population's pain. What am I supposed to do with that? And so within a broader media landscape in which we know that Sudan is being far underreported compared with Ukraine and Gaza, and now we've got Iran, right? So that's gonna, right, also kind of, take a slice of the proverbial pie. Um, what do we do with the fact that Sudan, which is the largest, demographically speaking, the largest crisis of them all, I find myself not only speaking into kind of a media ecosystem that is privileging, non-Black pain, but I'm also speaking into a media ecosystem that's like Sudan matters just as much as Gaza. And I think that that's kind of an unpopular, thing to say. And I think there's a lot of historically rooted reasons, right? Again, why African American solidarity with Gaza is big. And like, I get it. I completely do. Um, as an historian of Sudan and as a Black American historian of Sudan, I then have to contend with, well, what makes a Black person from Chicago, Atlanta, Detroit, what makes them more likely to read, the news piece on what happened in Gaza last week and not the piece on what happened in Khartoum, right? I think that we really need to interrogate that because I think that, the possible answers to that question speaks to how Blackness itself, right, and what it means um to know the experience of Black pain and Black dispossession and disenfranchisement. Um, but yes, what Blackness means and how it's defined right now, I think is at the heart of the answers to those questions.
I think Gayatri Spivak says the same thing when she includes an addendum to that essay. And she goes on to say that, therefore, as a scholar of post-colonial studies, our job is not to necessarily put the marginalized voice forward, but is to study the powers and forces and structures that make that voice be subjugated compared to others. So I have a few questions, but just to begin with something very practical. We know about the concept of framing theory, which basically means that it's the media also that's a culprit in making the war in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, known to the world compared to what's going on in Sudan. It's very often about how you present it.
Sure.
What do you wish would be done at a practical level by the media, by scholars, to make up for this inequality?
Yeah, that's a great question. Practically speaking, I will identify kind of the most kind of glaring sites that are currently not in balance and call for more balance. So one area is literally in the kind of practical, like the number of media articles that have been posted on Gaza, right? I mean, it dwarfs Sudan. It's like 80 or 90 times as much as those in Sudan. So at a very kind of mundane level, literally just put more, like produce more articles on Sudan, right? Both places in the world are very difficult to access and very difficult to navigate if you are a journalist, right? Um, but here's the thing, right? And, all three of us on this call know this, right? In addition to the framing piece, which is, very, very important, right? We know that news is a commercial industry, right? And that advertisers, have a very, outsized influence with networks. And so these networks know, you know, that there are certain certain topics, certain stories, certain buzzwords that are gonna get clicks, right? We live in a grotesque world where pain is clickbait, right? And so there's a way in which um I think the commercialization of news is kind of like an existential problem when it comes to, you know, imagining a world where, the suffering and pain of relatively unknown peoples or populations um, is going to kind of stay unknown, right? Unless networks decide to basically publish things and don't care about, how many people click or how many people engage with that, right? So one is, I think, just putting more out there, right? But two, I think this is where podcasts come in. And I'm not just saying that because I'm on one right now. I'm saying that, we know that podcasts are not beholden to the mega forces that a lot of these, global news networks and stuff have to basically contend with, right? And so having podcasts talking about Sudan, right? As a professor, I'm always going to say, you know, we as scholars engage with, the next generation on a daily basis. And so when we're teaching our next class on genocide in the 21st century, right? Or, when we have a budget of, a couple $1,000 and we're like, should we invite, this person or this person or this person or this person, right? Um, we need to be having more events about Sudan. We need to be having more conversations about Sudan, right? And I think last but not least, um, you know, we already have the roadmap. We have the blueprint. I think that one of the most successful um, kind of protest movements in recent history was the anti-apartheid movement. I was born in 1987, so I can't say that I can like remember what that was like through a primary lens, but the amount of protests on college campuses, right? The fact that the US Congress, overrode President Reagan's veto to divest from South Africa, right? But that it actually happened, right? South Africa became an international pariah that most of the world, but in this country, this polarized bipartisan country, even in this country in the 1980s, people on the left and right were like, we can do something, right? And so to me, I think that I'm not saying we should do the exact same things that occurred in the anti-apartheid movement, but it does mean we're not starting from a blank slate. Like we don't have to think completely outside the box. It's like the models are there. So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do want to say this as someone, I mean, Luis and I have both been running and managing this podcast for more than 2 years now. And we've always noticed that obviously most of the views revolve around the genocides that are more spoken about. Of course, there's an element of also the popularity of the speaker. But even if we do try to make sure that we move away from this philosophy that, or rather this practice of believing that some genocides are more equal than others. We're trying to diversify. We're trying to move away from that by covering as many genocides as possible and speaking to many people. We feel that the concentration is always on the main genocides. So here is a thought, and this is just to complicate the plot a little bit. But ultimately, as what Slavoj Žižek says, desire is not created from within. It's created because we are exposed to the media, we're exposed to films, and those create desires in us. So here I would say the main question that has popped up in our minds, and sometimes it might sound simplistic, but many of us wonder, why Gaza? Why Gaza? Why, Israel and Palestine over all the other genocides? And we're talking about South Sudan, East Timor,
Hmm.
Bangladesh, and so on. Why is there this concentration? Is it just the effect of the media, the fact that media concentrates on that and creates these desires in us? That's one point. I'm open to any comments from you, but I also want to say something as a genocide studies scholar, something that frustrates me. Um, I think at the end of the day, unfortunately, as in all matters, it's about where the money is. And
Yes.
I say this because I think of how when I study the Holocaust or when I go to presentations by Holocaust studies scholars, I see them going into all the intricate details of what happened during the Holocaust and explore unknown territories. And the Holocaust till today, I mean, I just attended a presentation by a professor, Edward Westerman, who explored the effects of not just famine during the Holocaust, which we've covered quite widely, but also the effects specifically of water, of thirst on the population. And my first reaction was to wonder, why haven't we explored that aspect of it in other genocides? Why do we always wait for for Holocaust studies scholars to unveil something and then we end up borrowing those models and apply to other genocides around the world? I also think of another example being how the concept of first generation, second generation, third generation survivors are omnipresent in Holocaust studies, and a lot of literature has been written on that. We have books written by survivors, again, third, fourth generation survivors of the Holocaust. And yet, do we speak about survivors of the Armenian genocide,
Hmm.
third, fourth generation, which we do have because the Armenian genocide happened before the Holocaust? Do we have first, second generation survivor accounts from, say, Congo or wherever else where there has been a genocide previously? And my answer is no. So the question is, why is there more complexity, as I said, in Holocaust studies compared to
Hmm.
other areas? And I can only say, going back to my PhD days as a student, I remember friends sitting around at a conference and saying, try to do something on the Holocaust rather than any other genocide, because that's where the money is. That's where we're going to get scholarships. That's where we're going to easily get into different educational institutions that, by the way, exist only in Europe, mostly in Europe and in America.
I do agree that I think money. I think is the answer because I don't want to believe that it's based on like philosophical reasons or a type of human callousness to, some people's pain over others. But as someone with a speech impediment, I'm familiar with there was this ancient Greek philosopher, and his name was Demosthenes. And Demosthenes said, everything that ought to be done can only be done with money, right? Everything that ought to be done can only be done. All people's pain, right? Every instance of mass violence in recorded history deserves to be interrogated, researched, right? Deserves all the resources in the world for people to examine with the obvious ultimate goal of preventing future occurrences, right? Um, I think that certainly in the West, I think if we follow the money, right? And it's not even just for, well, so I'll just speak for my own institution, and I'm gonna stay on the kind of objective things, right? As with all institutions, right, there are some departments, there are some areas studies programs that have a history going back 100 years, and they've got the, big pocket donors, and it's like they can, virtually speaking, do what they want. they can have a conference every other month. They can, fly people in and right. And you've got other units that, are no less passionate and serious about their work, but they just don't have the same access to the financial resources. And of course, there can be, several reasons for that, but it's just to say, you know, Unit A might be able to do a lot more because they have a lot more, and Unit B can't do as much because they simply cannot fund the work and the kind of public engagement and the scholarship that they want to do. Um, Sadly, I think that is one of the reasons why you know, you can fill libraries with certain acts of, mass violence or certain, people, presidents, prime ministers, right? Um, and we still in 2025, right, when information and access to information is more quick and ubiquitous than any moment in human history, right? But one can still come up with a provocative new book about, a black or brown population, right? That is like completely new, completely fresh, and offers a completely, right? Um, so I do agree with you. I think that money is at the root. And I think that in acknowledging that, right, I think the challenge for, us on this call is to say, okay, what can we do about it then, right? We can't make money grow on trees, right? And we can't, um, reverse the,
Yeah.
histories of explanations for why this department has more, why this event is examined more, right? But what can we do, right? And I do think more and more that, that is that has become a larger part of the job, right? So, when we have to teach courses, we get to decide, look, you know, my students probably know more in their pinky about this subject than they know about this, but I'm going to be the one to make sure that for this quarter or this semester, they will have to read about Sudan, right? They will see Gaza on TV. They'll see it on the front page of their newspaper. They'll see it all that. And they should also learn about Gaza in college, right? Like, yes, 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 right? But if I know that for every 10 things about, Ukraine or Gaza or Iran, there's going to be maybe point 0.2 about Sudan, then I get to determine whether my class is going to talk about Sudan most, right?
Yeah.
I think that that's really the kind of where we're at.
I think it's really great. I just want to go back and, re-emphasize on this point that you made about how the duty is on us, whether we have podcasts or we have Facebooks, we've got social
Hmm.
media. And I think one of the early lessons I learned when social media became a thing
Hmm.
is how we can fight against the gradient of power between media, main media outlets, and us, who are also today knowledge producers, who are news producers. We can change or not reverse the balance. I'm not that romantic, but I think we can try to reduce it by making sure that we make up for this lacuna by the media, where the media is creating desire. And I mean this metaphorically, whereby the media is diverting or focusing all our attention on what's going on with Gaza at the expense of other unknown, forgotten, silenced genocides in the world.
Hmm. Yes.
I have a question. How do you understand the role of US and UAE involvement in shaping the current conflict in Sudan?
Yes. Um, directly, right? I think that, you know, what has been kind of universally recognized by whether it's Human Rights Watch, the UN, Amnesty International, you know, and the United States government itself, right? Is that Sudan in many ways is increasingly a proxy war, right? Um, the UAE, which, as we know, geographically small country, but economically huge country, right? Um, the UAE has been directly supporting the Rapid Support Forces, right? The conflict, of course, being waged between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces. Um, the UAE is very interested in Sudan because of gold. The Sudan shipped out, I think in 2022, $1 billion worth of gold to the UAE alone, right? And the UAE to this day is kind of the world's clearinghouse, if you will, for gold. And so the UAE is very keen on having kind of easy access to gold in Sudan. And so because of that, they have sided with the Rapid Support Forces, who is in essence, in a very transactional way, um, giving the UAE access to gold in return for drones, right? And financial resources and kind of, you know, state cover, if you will. And so UAE produced drones have been located at sites of mass violence and genocide in Sudan since the war began, right? Way back in April 2023. Um, the UAE is also very much interested in Sudan for the agricultural sector as well, right? Sudan, you know, which, and this is also not reported much, but Sudan historically, because of the Nile, has really been an agricultural breadbasket, right? The UAE, right, in terms of thinking long term and thinking about climate change, they want to be really, you know, great partners with breadbasket countries, and Sudan represents that, right? So there's that. Um, the US gets involved or is complicit, of course, because the US is allies with the UAE, right? The UAE being a very, you know, important kind of, you know, friend in that region, right? And so there is absolutely a sense in which the US is, well, the United States government is disincentivized from really bringing down the hammer on the UAE for its complicity because the UAE is itself a very strong partner, right? And so, yeah, then you mix in countries like, you know, Iran, which has helped the Sudanese armed forces with their own drones because Iran would like to kind of apply pressure on Saudi Arabia. And so having, you know, Sudan as a partner right across the Red Sea would help to kind of, you know, apply more pressure, not just on Saudi Arabia, but also the state of Israel. You've got Russia, right, who, like the UAE, is very invested in extracting Sudanese gold in order to insulate itself from the bevy of international sanctions that it has had since it invaded Ukraine in 2022. China is impacted because China is very interested in Sudanese petroleum, right? South Sudan sits on an ocean of oil, and so the kind of Port Sudan is, you know, a very critical lifeline in terms of the flow of oil, not just to the Middle East, but further east, you know, in Southeast Asia. Um, you've got Egypt, right, just to the north, which is run by its own kind of career autocratic soldier in al-Sisi. And Egypt is very keen on making sure that its access of the Nile River is not threatened because for the last 5,000 years, Egypt has seen the Nile as the existential piece of its geography. So for all of these reasons, right, I argued very early on that what's going on in Sudan is the closest thing to a kind of, worldwide proxy war since the Congo crisis of 1960, where all of the quote unquote great powers are very invested in an outcome that ultimately benefits them. And that at this point, profits are being prioritized over people's lives. And so that's absolutely hindering the peacemaking process, right? Which, again, countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the US are all involved, but the very countries involved in trying to broker a peace between those two are at the same time very invested in an outcome that will ultimately benefit themselves.
Before we go, we wanted to go ahead and begin a new segment, especially with you, because we've considered so many topics within this discussion. Can you go ahead and present us with 2 book recommendations that you have, either related to genocide studies, related to the topics today, or not?
Let me see. I would recommend, for one, Mahmoud Mamdani's book on Darfur, which is really about the Darfur genocide of the early 2000s. But he talks about kind of how, you know, Darfur kind of enters this, Western ecosystem of Islamophobia and kind of anti Arab sentiments. And I think that that's kind of like a great, entryway into that. And I would be remiss if I didn't say I would recommend Bounds of Blackness. And I would recommend it not only as, kind of an accessible text that talks about the United States in relation to Sudan, right? But also kind of Sudan's place within the global Black imaginary, right? And so thinking about Sudan as a particularly important location within the Black world and not just Africa specifically.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We greatly appreciate talking with you.
All right, thank you so much.
This was Not to Forgive, but to Understand, with our guest, Christopher Tounsel. To our listeners, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more discussions.